everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Nickel, and I'm an educator at the Ringling. And today I am joined by our Tibbles curator of the circus, Jennifer Lemmer Posey, who's going to talk a little bit in a three-part series about what it meant to own a circus and what it meant to perform in a circus and how self-image and representation played out in circus advertisements. So without further ado, Jennifer Lemmer Posey.
Thanks, Katie. So I'm excited to have a chance to talk to a group of younger people about imagery of the circus, because when I walk through the galleries and see our collections, I see a lot of relevance and parallels to today's society, and particularly in advertising. So when Katie started talking to me about portraiture, I went, oh, there are portraits in posters. There are portraits all over the circus, and they're really important to the circus, much in the same way that portraiture has been important through the history of art. So I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and I thought, well, the first thing I should figure out is what portrait really comes first in circus advertising. And while it can't be definitive, it is not surprising that Phineas Barnum is the very first person that you see on a regular basis appearing with his portrait in circus posters. So I've decided we should call him the first face of American entertainment, because really there is very few showmen whose image has stuck around in the way Barnum's has. And I start out with this wonderful 1884 poster from P.T. Barnum. It's part of the Ringling Museum collection. As you can see, it's an old poster. It's in need of some conservation, but it says everything, doesn't it? Barnum has created his own image right there in the middle. You see exactly who he is, the man, but all around him is what makes him the person that would become this son of the amusement world, as he's decided to call himself. So he's told his whole life story in this piece of print advertising. And I think it's really important to think about how a portrait, and in this case, a portrait that is not just the picture of the person, but a narrative of who that person is, creates the sense of yourself that you put out into the world. We certainly do that today with social media. And I think Barnum really pioneered how one could control your image through mass media, in this case, printed advertisements. While we're on this image, I want to just take a moment to point out, not only is Barnum here in the middle, but he's put down this side, down the left side of the poster, images of himself in government. He was the mayor of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Up at the top is his American Museum, which was really his first endeavor. Starting in the 1840s, he becomes this popular show person based on that. He brought Jenny Lind, as we know from the movie, and even his home, Iranistan, was part of the image that he built for himself. Down here, you see the elephant Jumbo that he brought for the circus. What I think is really kind of funny is that you don't actually see circus tents in this poster. And that's really in part because Barnum only became a showman, a circus man, in the last years of his life. Preparing for this talk, I sat down with one of my kids, who is a preteen, and asked her if she saw any alignments with Barnum and popular media today. And she said, well, he doesn't look much like Hugh Jackman. So that was eye-opening to me, is that the first thing I really did need to address was this movie, right? The Greatest Showman came out in 2017, and it is based loosely on the life of P.T. Barnum. But it really takes a lot of liberties. However, I think it's very much in the spirit of Barnum, about entertaining people and bringing people together. What I liked a lot when I put these two images together, one is obviously Hugh Jackman, as we all now believe Barnum looked, and then this older daguerreotype of Barnum that dates back to 1849. I think it's really telling how much of Hugh Jackman's stance is picking up on the way Barnum held himself. We really see who this showman was and how that's carried out almost 130 years after his death. We know who Barnum is. We know who Barnum is because of these photographs, because Barnum entered into the American history and American imagination about the same time that photography and commercial lithography became viable as ways to mass produce your image. And not only that, but Barnum and his American Museum were in New York City on Broadway, which happened to be the site of all of these commercial photographic studios that popped up. So this image, as I mentioned, which is P.T. Barnum and Tom Thumb, comes from 1849. The photographer was Samuel Root, and he had a studio right on Broadway, so probably very close to the American Museum. Other photographers like Matthew Brady, who would later be known for photographing the Civil War, were there as well. And that's how Barnum and some of his performers became so well known, is they had their photos taken and then they were able to sell them and mass distribute their image out into the world. So yeah, I mean, it's amazing. We don't think about photographs being rare, right? Today we can snap a photo, we can snap 100 photos and there's no cost to it. But those daguerreotypes, just to go back for a second, are actually printed on metal, the photo, and it's a one-time photograph. So you could take photographs of this photograph, but they couldn't just mass produce this one image in a print form like we can today. So it was an expensive thing to invest in this time, but Barnum knew that it was a worthwhile way to spread his fame. So this all paid off tremendously well for Barnum, because he really did become known through Tom Thumb, through Jenny Lind, through all of these performers as the greatest showman in America, presenting things through the American Museum and then his touring attractions. So much so that the circus industry looked to Barnum as somebody who they could call upon to draw in audiences. And so his circus career actually began when Barnum was about 70 years old, well, 60 years old to begin it. And that was when he was invited by two experienced circus showmen, W.C. Coop and Dan Costello, to add his name to a traveling circus. This particular print is a couple of years after Costello and Coop, although they're still helping to manage his show. So you see P.T. Barnum's Great Traveling World's Fair, full menagerie. You don't actually see the word circus, but you get to see all of the kinds of curiosities that would come with Barnum, all the animals and all these wonderful exotic people in the background. And over the top of it all is Barnum himself. So in each one of these images, he's building his national renown by putting his own image in the middle of these very interesting sites. So it wasn't just those first circus men who experienced the fame of Barnum. This is one of the most curious pieces in the Tibbles Circus collection. It's a scrap of a circus poster. It dates from about 1881. If you came across it without much knowledge of circus history, I think you'd still recognize Barnum right there in the middle of the tree. But beyond that, it might be a little bit obscure, a little hard to understand. What this is Barnum, and you can see at the bottom the text, "New life grafted into the old oak." So Barnum is the old oak. Again, he is in his later 60s at this point. He has been around, he's well known, and these two younger men up at the top, on the left you see James Bailey shaking the hand of the giant Chang, and then on the right is James Hutchinson, who was Bailey's original partner. So these two have managed to convince Barnum to become a partner in their enterprise and their great circus. And you can see the tents in the background. So this time we know it's a circus that we're looking at. But Bailey and Hutchinson are banking on the idea that you're going to recognize Barnum, and that by having their faces in this image, you're going to start to think more of them, that their esteem will rise because they are directly associated with Barnum and this great circus that is laid out behind them. Again, when I was talking to my preteen, I was trying to talk about what this meant. Like, when you associate yourself with the image of somebody who is well known. And so I asked her, can you think of any examples? And she wasn't totally sold because she knew who Barnum was, but Bailey and Hutchinson were a little beyond her. So I thought of this image with the Kardashians. I think it's a pretty well recognized image now. It's a bathroom selfie taken at the Met Gala in, I think it was 2018. And apparently, so the Met Gala doesn't let you take pictures out on the floor. They want to keep all of that so that they can get the press. But celebrities are known to go into bathrooms and take pictures so they can share them, which is just kind of funny in and of itself. In this case, when you look at the image, when I look at the image, I recognize the Kardashian Jenner family. I see those. There are a few other people, but many of these people I feel like are the Bailey and Hutchinsons of the day, right? They're probably minor celebrities. Some people may recognize them anyway, but by being in this photo and in this moment with the Kardashians and with P. Diddy, they have raised themselves up in a way, and they've associated themselves with a level of celebrity that is, a step above. So it's been going on for hundreds of years. As soon as we can put our image out into the world, we want to see how we can elevate that image. Barnum himself was guilty of these kinds of things. So this is another poster. It dates from about 1882. And what it's showing in this picture is Barnum, P.T. Barnum, presenting Tom Thumb and his wife, who are there on the table, the small people, to the heads of Europe. So in this case, it's Queen Victoria and the whole royal family of Britain, which did happen. It's a historic event, but in this case, it had happened almost 2 decades before, and Barnum is using this as a way to elevate his stature as he's advertising his circus. For this one season, Tom Thumb made appearances on Barnum's circus. It's the only year that Tom Thumb was actually with a circus at all. So it's one of those moments when you watch The Greatest Showman, circus and American Museum and all of these things kind of combine in Barnum's life, but they were actually very different time periods. Barnum, however, was more than happy to have them collapse back and forth so that he could raise his own image in popular culture. So much so that the imagery of Barnum became kind of fantastic and even a little bit silly sometimes. Again, we're looking in the early 1880s, and this is where the partnership between Barnum and these two gentlemen, Bailey and Hutchinson, is going really strong. And they're really banking on the idea that Barnum is such a global phenomenon that we can have this wonderful caricature. So at the very top of the globe, P.T. Barnum stands tall, taller than anybody else, with Bailey and Hutchinson sitting beside him. And I think this is where it starts to pay off to read images and think about them a little. Bailey and Hutchinson didn't want to appear as though they were bigger than Barnum, so they're seated. But they also didn't want to appear as though they were lesser than Barnum, because that would demote their imagery. So, by seating them on the ground, they're able to stay under him and yet kind of maintain the same stature. Whereas all of the men wandering the globe and bringing back these exotic creatures are all considerably smaller. These are the people that work for them, that do the things for them. So there's this idea of how you present yourself is really important in this advertising, even in ways that we don't necessarily consciously read. This was taken up, that kind of imagery, caricatures and kind of making fun of people in a sense, was snatched up by Barnum's competition. I love this poster. It's one of the first of this kind that I ever saw. And the gentleman standing tall in the center is Adam Forepaugh. You see his name at the bottom. At this time, again, mid-1880s, because this was this small period of time where they decided to really focus on the caricatures and the use of Barnum as a figure. Adam Forepaugh was probably as well known as P.T. Barnum at this precise moment in time. He was a really influential circus owner. His circus was as big as Barnum's, was offering equal quality acts. He could go anywhere in the country and be known for the quality of his show. Now, he was a horse trader. He was a really kind of salt of the earth character, and he was known to sit by the front door of the circus. So he didn't bank as much on making his own face public, but he had to compete with Barnum. And so suddenly he was faced with that need to align himself with his own image. So you start to see his portrait on posters, but you also get these moments, and there are a few of these quirky posters, where Adam Forepaugh is a giant among the pygmies. And down at the bottom, if you're paying close attention, you see P.T. Barnum and his partners, James Bailey, who's the center figure, and James Hutchison, who's off to the right, and they're running away. It's worth noting the other two gentlemen are actually equally well-known show owners, the Sells brothers, whose names have just kind of gotten lost to history. But Adam Forepaugh knew that this was his major competition, and so he put Barnum's image on his posters, because that way you still get to see Barnum, and you realize that Adam Forepaugh is clearly bigger and better. Barnum didn't like that. So this poster, which actually is part of the Cincinnati Art Museum's collection, and I think is just extraordinary. It's the only known example I know of this image. And it doesn't have a show title on it because it's part of the proof books from the printer, Strobridge Lithographing Company. But we see at the bottom Barnum ox. And at the top is the parable of the frog and the ox. It's a tale by Aesop. And it's this fabulous tale wherein the frog has seen this beautiful ox go by, and he's so impressed by the size of the ox that he decides to pull in his breath and make himself bigger, and maybe he can appear as big and as important as the ox. And so he does this, and he asks his friends at the pond if he now looks as magnificent as the ox. And his friends go, no, you're good, but the ox is still bigger and better. And so the frog inhales some more, and he still hasn't impressed anyone. And he inhales again, and he bursts. And so obviously the moral of this story is that one, you have to be who you are. You can't try to be somebody else. But Barnum has turned it into this wonderful mixed thing. One, he's sharing a moral story that's meant to teach you something, but he's also totally made fun of Adam Forepaugh. I mean, he's made him a little frog. He said, right off the bat, I'm bigger and better and prettier than you. I have a better circus, and you're never going to match me. All in this one image. And I think today we're so used to images and not text that this seems very dense to us. It's a lot. You have to read the story, you have to take in, you have to know who these people are. But for people in the late 19th century who were not driving by in cars, they were walking on streets, they had the time to read. These colorful images really pulled them in. And it had this wonderful way of aligning the morality of Aesop's fables with the spectacle of the circus. So this poster kind of checks all the boxes for interesting ways to use portraiture. Ultimately, it comes down to just the importance of Barnum as a figure. So when Barnum brings Jumbo to America from the UK, he and his partners have kind of relaxed to a very standardized form of advertising where they put their portraits down the left side. And they make sure everybody knows exactly who's involved in the show, but then they let the attractions, be the bigger portion of it. And by the time Barnum dies in 1891, Bailey really is just relying on the name and the imagery of their two portraits. By this time, Hutchinson has dropped out, and it's just the Barnum and Bailey show. And so James Bailey continues to let Barnum loom large and be the name that would come through history to us today. So that's my thoughts on Barnum as the first face of American entertainment.
I think that's so fascinating because P.T. Barnum, even though he lived and died over 100 years ago, he's still a household name. And it is interesting to see how other people were using his name for their own self-image, even in his own lifetime.
I think too, for me, from sitting here in the 21st century, we assume today how easy it is to share a likeness and how easy it is to become a social media star, even if it is only for that little blip of time. And that makes me think that it would be very difficult to do in the late 19th century. You don't have sound recordings, really. There's one sound recording of P.T. Barnum's voice, but that's really the only kind of time-based media that exists of Barnum. There's no film, there's none of that. So he created his imagery, but the fact that he jumped on photography and then commercial printing right from the start of his career and used that to push his face out into the public, first in New York for the American Museum, but then growing when he took Tom Thumb on tours and Jenny Lind, who did tour America under Barnum's management. That was his opportunity to make sure that everyone across the country knew who P.T. Barnum was. And then Bailey perpetuates it because he keeps that Barnum name even after Barnum's gone. When you say Bailey, people don't necessarily think of circus, but if you say Barnum, they do. And that was in part his choice. So I think people recognize how important that name is. Certainly the movie was made in part because his story still is compelling and interesting to us today.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, who is the P.T. Barnum of our day? I think your analogy of the Kardashian, the Jenner Kardashian family is really apt, because we're fascinated with them, whether or not we approve of them or whether or not we like them, which I imagine is much the same case in Barnum's own day. It almost doesn't matter because we become so fascinated with their image.
Yeah.
It's just super interesting to think, who are the individuals that we idolize or that we see their images all over and over and over again today. Who's going to have that posterity? Who's going to be remembered in 150 years?
Right. Well, and I think it's very different. And maybe we'll talk about this further through the series. That branding is a different beast today because you want to be able to be relatable to many different kinds of people. And yet there are still certain companies. You look at Apple and Steve Jobs. I can't even tell you right now how many years it's been since he passed away, but he as a person and, as a persona is so totally mixed into the brand of Apple that, he seems very much aligned. The Kardashians have built themselves up, and there's certainly other characters in reality TV programming that you could make the same claim about, that have kind of really crafted how they want to be perceived. And you see it in politics today too, across the board, and not even pointing at specific levels, that we craft that public persona and we keep it very carefully contained within the imagery and the sound bites that we put out in the world. And even, looking at an image like this, what words we allow ourselves to be associated with Barnum and Bailey and with circus in general, it's always these over the top kinds of languages, whereas for social media stars, maybe it's always attached to the exotic places they go and the foods they eat. For politicians, it's attached to values and certain core beliefs of their parties. But we are now, I think all of us, a little bit of a Barnum in crafting our own identity in a bigger, broader world.
I think that's such an interesting point, and I think that that's a great way to end, kind of thinking about how are we being Barnums? How are we self-promoting? How do we curate our own image to advertise things about ourselves or to further our own greatness, if you will? Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and special thanks to Jennifer for showing us the wonders of Barnum, P.T. Barnum, and how he was used, not only how he used his own image, but how others used his image as well. Definitely some food for thought there. If you're interested in the idea of portraiture, particularly in circus posters, be sure to check out the other 2 videos in our series. This is the first of a 3-part series, and we hope to see you back soon.